Have you ever wondered how Vermont schools get funded and how your property taxes get calculated? You're not alone. It's pretty confusing. So we're here to break it down. First, local school boards create a budget for their district. And on town meeting day, residents either vote to approve or reject this budget. Once a voter-approved spending plan is in place, the school board sends the state a bill for basically the full amount. Now, the state must pay for all of these budgets, plus a few related expenses. And so in total this year, Vermont will spend $2.3 billion on education. But Vermont doesn't just use property taxes to pay for schools. We also have sales taxes, the lottery, and other sources feeding into the statewide education fund. In Montpelier, state lawmakers check how well these sources are doing, and then figure out how much they'll need to raise from property taxes to make up the difference. There are two types of school taxes: homestead property taxes, which are applied to primary residences, and non-homestead property taxes, which are applied to basically all other types of property, including commercial buildings, rental properties, and second homes. Now, the non-homestead rate is fairly simple. Technically, the legislature sets one statewide non-homestead rate. But to ensure fairness, we use a common level of appraisal, or CLA, to adjust the tax rate in each town. So each town's taxes reflect current and fair market values. Every town appraises its properties a little differently and on different timelines. So this helps make sure that towns with outdated appraisals aren't inadvertently getting their residents an unfair discount. So the tax department takes that one homestead rate that the legislature sets and then uses the CLA to adjust the rate from town to town. Homestead taxes, unfortunately, are trickier. Each school district gets a rate depending on their spending per student. Districts with lower spending per pupil have proportionally lower tax rates. Each district's homestead rate, which is pegged to that spending per pupil, is then adjusted again using each town's CLA. That is why homestead rates look different from town to town, even when those towns are in the same school district. The difference between tax rates before and after the CLA is applied can be jarring, so updates, which will be in effect in 2025, aim to bake in some of this adjustment earlier in the process so that people are less surprised when final rates come out. Now, we should note that this per pupil calculation that I mentioned earlier isn't straightforward. Some kids should cost more to educate, like students in rural settings or those living in poverty. So they're weighted differently when the state is figuring out how much a district is spending per pupil. Act 127, that new law you may have been hearing about, adjusted these weights. Plus, Vermont income sensitizes property taxes, meaning if your household earns below a certain amount, you get a tax credit. And roughly 2/3 of Vermonters receive such a credit. So how does this usually all come together in Montpelier? Well, unless lawmakers want to change the basic structure of the system, they typically have really two choices to make. First, they have to decide how much of the burden to put on the homestead tax versus non-homestead. And then, if they're lucky and the education fund has a surplus, they have to decide what to do with that extra cash. A surplus, however, can be a double-edged sword. One-time money is best spent on one-time expenses, but it's pretty tempting politically to use a surplus to take the pressure off property taxes. The problem with that, of course, is that education spending is an ongoing expense. And so when a surplus or any other type of one-time money is used to artificially buy down rates in one year, that means tax rates will have to play catch-up the following year. You risk a spike. Yes, it's super complicated. So why do we have a system that is so mind-numbingly complex? Why can't we make it simpler? Well, that's because fundamentally it's designed to be fair while preserving local control. 30 years ago, we had a very different system. While the state did provide some funding, school budgets were generally a local affair. School boards and local voters decided how much they wanted to spend, and then they set tax rates based on their local grand list to raise that money. There was one big problem with that system. Property-rich towns could spend lavishly on their schools, even with low tax rates, while property-poor towns struggled to pay for the basics, even with high tax rates. It wasn't fair. There was a lawsuit about it, and in 1997, the Vermont Supreme Court decided that the status quo was unconstitutional. In response, the legislature passed Act 60, and that is why we rely on a statewide education fund and not local grand lists to pay for schools. The basic notion of the law is this: whether you live in Bennington or Barrie, if your school is spending the same per pupil, your tax rate will be the same. Our education system is often hailed as one of the most progressive in the country, but it's not without its problems. One, it's incredibly complex, which means that it's difficult for voters to understand the implications of their vote when they're asked to weigh in on school budgets. Two, it's not cheap, and in an era of declining enrollment, some want to see more cost containment, although others argue that tax reform is the answer. And three, while it uses a lot of incentives to try and encourage the highest need districts to spend more and more privileged districts to spend a little less, local voters and school boards still get the final say on spending. And sometimes, more privileged communities still choose to spend more, while poorer communities still choose to spend less. So the challenge before us is this. Can we make the system more affordable? Can we make things more fair? Can we make things more legible to people on the ground? And can we do all of this while preserving local control? This is something we will be following closely. For Vermont Public, I'm cartoon Lola Duffort.